I'd like to begin by something very recent, which kind of explains the self-proclaimed dilemma that I am in as an artist and theorist and art historian and so forth. What happened is that I didn't have an undergraduate degree in art. I was an educational psychologist in the old days. And so I decided I was going to apply to a graduate program, and I applied to 4. 2 of them I was accepted, the San Francisco Art Institute and UMass Amherst. And UMass Amherst said, if you come, we'll give you a teaching associate. And I thought that was a pretty good deal, in that I had no experience in art other than what I was doing at the time. And then I took a course in Islamic art and architecture, which was one of the great art history classes, one of the only art history classes that I had before I got into my PhD. And it was taught by a Harvard professor, and he said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm an MFA student. He said, no, you should really be an art historian. So I said, how do I do that? And he said, you apply. And I said, oh, I didn't know that. I was totally naive about anything academic on that level, okay? And so I applied to NYU, and miraculously I got in, and I ended up writing the first dissertation on conceptual art in the United States, which was then later transformed into a book and then a series of other books and so forth. But the fact is that in recent years, I have been so focused on Asia in particular, which I suppose I have always been focused on Asia, but professionally, within the past 15, 20 years or so, it's taken an inordinate amount of time and great pleasure in taking it. So I'm doing that. I got an email this morning from someone in Brussels asking me if I would write a catalog for Lin Yan, who is a Beijing artist living with her husband Wei Jia in New York. And she wanted me to write an introduction for their catalog, which is forthcoming. The show is forthcoming, I believe, in September. And she said, and in addition to your expertise, we're going to have another writer who focuses on conceptual art. And so I said, oh, that's very interesting. And so I listed a few of my books and so forth. I haven't gotten a response yet. But the fact is that I am in more than one field. And when people ask me what my specialty is at dinner parties, I look at them and I say, I wish you asked me that 30 years ago. I could have answered it better than I can today. Sometimes I know what I'm doing, and sometimes I don't. The fact is that earlier this summer, I had a show of my paintings in Florence, which was a delight for me, because I've never had a solo show in Europe before. And of course, once I got into the art historical and critical aspect of my career, a lot of the time that I needed to really paint seriously and think through the issues, what you're all doing, was somewhat limited. So it became increasingly more difficult, but I finally, I think, figured out a way to do it. I'm turning 71 in 3 days, okay? So sometimes it takes a little time, okay, to figure things out. It doesn't happen always right away. And there are ups and downs, and you all know this. Sometimes you struggle. I remember in the days when postmodernism came onto the scene in the early 1980s, and I was at a panel somewhere, maybe it was at SVA, I don't know, and somebody was complaining about the fact that as a postmodernist, we're not interested in artists who struggle. And I thought, that's an interesting point of view, because I think that whether you're modernist or postmodernist or whatever category you want to put yourself in, if you need a category, I think that all artists struggle on some level, whether it's financial. I mean, paying the rent in New York is not so easy, as we know. There are other expenses that keep going up and up and up, and not everybody is in the same income category. There are metaphysical struggles, if I dare use that word. I remember when that was used in a lecture that Derrida gave at Columbia, everybody chuckled in the audience, and then Derrida stopped and he said, no, I'm serious. Metaphysics, just because I wrote, against the problematic point of view of Heidegger. It doesn't mean that I don't respect metaphysics. I think that it's very interesting that metaphysics has occupied so much of philosophy, certainly up until Wittgenstein, but I think it began to come back. It did come back, in fact, with the French pre-phenomenologists, shall we say, and I find metaphysics at this point, particularly in my dealings with Chinese artists who are very oriented toward that, less from the point of view of Aristotle than they are with Confucius, because we can, I think, say from an Eastern point of view that perhaps Confucius has the call in terms of metaphysical awareness and how that is taken and applied to everyday affairs, which is something that is pervasive, I think, in China even now with the new entrepreneurship. There is, how do you take these metaphysical beliefs about who you are in the world and the problems that we deal with in terms, and the struggles we deal with in terms of trying to understand who we are in the world. How do you put that into a pragmatic context from a Chinese point of view? I think that this is one of the major social struggles that is going on in China today. Maybe that should reflect back to the United States, because I think that we could use a little metaphysics here as long as it's applied in a way that is making people function together rather than separating one from another. I was somewhat taken by a comment that Jeff Koons made at his press opening a week and a half ago, or whenever that was, before I went to Shanghai. Koons said something to the effect that, you know, all my work is metaphysical. And I felt like raising my hand and saying, no, it's not, but because I wanted to know what he meant. I wanted him to talk about that, but he never did. And I wondered where he got that idea. I have to say personally that looking at that exhibition, metaphysics would probably be the last thing on my mind. I think that there are other kinds of concerns that are much more predominant and not necessarily that. Okay, we are dealing with another kind of struggle, I think, at this moment, which perhaps we can call a global struggle. And of course, we have global artists now that want to detach themselves from their respective cultures. I remember when this came up maybe 10 or 12 years ago in conversation with a very well-known Korean artist. And at that point, I think she was making a tremendous leap forward, and I've always been a supporter of her work and written about it extensively and so forth. But she said to me, you know, Robert, I am not a Korean artist, I'm a global artist. And I thought, oh, how do you skip over the culture of which you're so much a part, which has informed your work in very specific ways, and suddenly become global? And you know, she was very serious. She's a very smart woman. And she said, well, you know, to put yourself in a kind of nationalistic category is very problematic today. Now, this is 12 years ago. I think that that was a good response because presumably globalization has something to do with nations. But I decided a number of years ago in Korea when I was at a conference, I think it was the Kwangju Biennial. It was the Kwangju Biennial. I remember that John Sukwan was the artistic commissioner at that time, a great artist and scholar in his own right. And there was the issue of globalization. It was something that hadn't been heard so much in the art world. I remember Carolyn Christophe Bogarkiev was the leader of the panel at that time. This is 14 years ago. And we're talking about different kinds of globalization. And I decided that there were two fundamental kinds. One is economic globalization, which is generally what we hear about or have heard about, and more directly perhaps in the past in terms of the application of that term. And then there is another type of globalization that we can call cultural globalization, okay? Now, Carolyn asked me, what is the difference between the two? And I said, well, let me put it this way. It's a very simple analysis, but I think I'm right. From an economic point of view, you want to look at the globe from the outside in. In other words, you want to find the magnets of control in various points in the globe, and you want to deal with the resources that come and go in relation to those centers, okay? But it all has to somehow coordinate. And the wealth, in a very idealistic manner, is supposed to be shared among these various points. Well, I think there's less sharing now, as we've seen with Greece and Spain and Italy and numerous countries in the developing world, Indonesia I'm thinking of in particular, that the resources are not being shared, but the wealth is being grabbed. And so you can do it two ways. You can look at this globe, at these magnet points, and you can decide where the wealth is going to come your way, or you can try and release the tension and allow the spread of resources to exist in various parts of the world, which I think was how it was originally intended and why so many Nobel Prizes were given for people who theorized in the area of globalization, because it was really seen 15, 20 years ago as a step forward that just happened to link up with the rise in advanced communication technology, which of course foresaw at that time the ability to make instant contact and to facilitate this spread of wealth and resources. So in essence, the view of the economist who is involved in globalization, which I think it would be difficult not to be involved in globalization in this day and age, they're looking at the globe from the outside in. So what about the artist? Now, this goes back a ways because I think that there's a lot of slippage today in terms of these categories, and they were never meant to be hard and fast. But I think from the point of view of the artist, the ideal would go from the inside out. In other words, at one time in New York, back 70 years ago, we were seeing the end of abstract expressionism and the beginning of neo-Dada, Fluxus pop art, and the various movements that evolved in the 1960s. We began to see that these were happening in New York. You know, there was a great period in American art from 1945 to 1974. That's almost 30 years. This was the great period in American art. You know something? We haven't gotten back there since 1974, okay? New York has been transformed into an art market, which is very different than an art world, which is something I talk about in one of my books, The End of the Art World. But anyway, the point is that we have this problem now of how to move out of these geographical centers like abstract expressionism head, like pop art head, more or less. I mean, it came from the UK to us, but it didn't exactly come. The ideas came by way of Lawrence Alloway, the critic, largely, and to some extent Richard Hamilton, who's virtually ignored in this culture for some reason, one of the most important artists of the last 50 years, in my opinion. Anyway, the point is that we now have another opportunity. And I began to figure this out. There was a period in my career where I was going a lot to Eastern Europe. And in a conversation with Richard Vashko, who is a magnificent artist and wonderful thinker and human being, and we were talking, and he said, Robert, I think that the future is not going to be geographical centers for movements to spur and rise and come into fruition. Rather, we're going to see someone in Poland communicating with somebody in Denpasar, which is the capital of Bali. We're going to see somebody in London communicating with someone in Iowa City. We're going to see somebody in Buenos Aires communicating with somebody in Helsinki. As a matter of fact, these 6 artists may be on the same track. They may be linked in some way, and the new information technology is going to aid and abet this purpose. Now, when I say coming from the inside out, we now have the opportunity to break through the fixed geographical points and to operate globally, and I think this can be a form of utopianism. That it's possible that we have to think globally to revive what this kind of idealism could be for art. Now, there's another problem, because just as I mentioned resources in relation to economic globalization, there is also the issue of material in art. I am of the firm belief that one reason film came into galleries is that bronze and stone were too expensive to ship. It's not the whole story, but unless you're Tony Craig or the late Henry Moore, it's going to be extremely expensive to ship that work across the Atlantic or to move it from Europe to China. Last week I was in a museum called the Himalaya Museum, which is in the south side of Shanghai. And there's going to be a show by Sean Scully coming there, which I knew about. And those are big paintings. Somebody has to pay for shipping those big paintings. And they're not the kind of paintings you can easily break down. It's going to be a mammoth undertaking in terms of the price. Fortunately, they have a sponsor who is actually an American entrepreneur living in Hong Kong, as I understand. I've heard of this person. I've never met him personally. But the point is that the expense of moving art as material around today is extraordinary. And you can imagine the kind of pressure that it would put on the gallery to sell these works. And if through the media you can convince people that Tony Craig is far less interesting than Bruce Nauman, which some people believe. I've written a book on Bruce Nauman, so I'm supposed to believe that. Although I think the later work of his is not so interesting, but he's an important artist, there's no question. I remember a conversation I had with Robert Motherwell at his house up on 93rd back in 1970. I was on my way to Europe, and I really wanted to meet him, and I'd written him a letter. He sent me a letter back, and he said, come and let's talk for a few hours and so forth. So we sat there talking by his window, and he was trying to get out to get a cab or a car, whatever, to the airport. But he kept wanting to talk, so I said, no problem. And because Motherwell was a great scholar and probably influenced my own direction in terms of where I went. Except he's a better known painter, which is okay. It was a different time, and I understand that. And he was a great man. But Motherwell published a magazine called It Is, which was a magazine of abstract expressionist artists writing, essentially, about what they did. And I noticed that there was an essay in one of the issues by John Cage. I didn't know that he and John Cage were friendly. And I made the exclamation to Motherwell. I said, why do you have an essay by John Cage in a journal that is primarily, as far as I can tell, devoted to abstract expressionism? And he said, because his ideas are important. And I said, but you have very different ideas from Cage. And he looked at me and he says, of course, I have different ideas than Cage, but his ideas are important. And I thought to myself, my God, that's what's missing today. That's what's missing today. Do we have to agree with everybody in terms of what we do, not to respect what they do? Now, frankly, getting back to Jeff Koons, this has been a problem for me in terms of his work, but finally, I have to respect it, even though it's not what I do. I question some of the values, getting back to the metaphysical idea, that are represented. This is why I can't see where metaphysics comes into the picture with him. But the fact is that there is something there that is perhaps more symptomatic than it is significant. And I think that oftentimes the critics of the New York Times confuse these two constantly. That what is significant in art is something else. Symptomatic is the word I would use to describe the importance of Koons. It's symptomatic of our time. Is it significant? Not from my point of view, but it's definitely a mirror, as was Warhol, maybe not as good as Warhol, of the time, okay? So I think that when we use language in relation to talking about art, I think we should use it, at least from my point of view. Everybody is different. I have many friends who are critics. Actually, I don't have many. A lot of them hate me. But anyway, the point is I have some critics who are friends. And they will say things that cannot be supported from my point of view. And I'm always interested in the support structure of language that's talking about art. I think it's important. As William Carlos Williams said, the poet, go to the things themselves. In other words, the only thing you have to do when you make a claim is to go to a specific work or works and talk about how you are responding to that work, which is the best means of support for your point of view that I can think of in art. Now, we've gone through an era, and I say an era because it's been certainly more than 25 years, where instead of going to the things themselves, the art, to substantiate a point of view, the tendency is to go to theory. Now, I think the great era of post-structuralism is no longer with us. But I knew Derrida, I knew Baudrillard, we were on panels together, and again, I respected them. And they were far more capable than I am of theorizing, far more. And I could understand the attraction, because after going through a kind of flippant time when, I remember when I was in my MFA program, that basically the responsibility of the instructor was to show up, okay? And when you had a critique, there was no such thing as objectivity in terms of being able to pull back and describe what you see, take an inventory of what's there, begin to maybe feel something in relation to what you're seeing. Now, not all work is the same, so we can't generalize about that kind of feeling. However, it's very interesting to note that Donald Judd, who we may think to be the least susceptible to that, was once asked what the meaning of empiricism was, because he always insisted for most of his career as an artist that he was not a minimalist, that he was an empiricist. And he says, my empirical values are based on knowing, feeling. Huh, interesting, okay? Was there such a separation from a critic like Greenberg and Donald Judd? You know, that it was purported to be the case. I'm sure that there were many points of difference. There's no question in my mind. I can probably articulate them if I think about them. But the point is that the idea of somehow feeling one of those stacks that Mnuchin showed a few months ago would be something that people would be embarrassed perhaps to articulate or to state. That is not the kind of work you talk about in those terms. On the other hand, I'm fairly sure that Claude Monet got pissed off when people spoke about feelings in relation to his paintings. Because remember, those paintings were supposed to be about the passage and transfer of light in relation to the cathedral at Rouen, in relation to the haystacks. That we are seeing the passage of light, which Monet believed to be objective. Therefore, if somebody is in rapture about the color of the poppies, maybe that's not what he wanted them to see. But then we fall back on the problem that Duchamp presents in his famous talk, The Creative Act, that he gave in Houston in 1957 at the American Federation of Arts, where he talks about the viewer completing the work. That there is the art coefficient, as he says in that essay, that the art has to be seen and completed in terms of how it is understood and how it's felt. And what establishes its importance, ultimately, is the consensus of people somehow coming to an agreement over time, whether they know each other or not is something else. But if there is a kind of discourse that evolves in relation to that work, then we can call it significant, okay? Which is more than something that is symptomatic. Now, symptomatic is often used in the medical profession in terms of diagnosis, that a person has symptoms of a particular kind of flu, for example. And in that sense, I believe that work being presented in West Chelsea or Berlin or Beijing, we could often talk about it as maybe suffering in a way, of being somewhere tilted toward visual anthropology. Sometimes it's difficult to glean any sense of rapture or feeling or even disgust with a work of art. Heaven forbid disgust. Even if it was that, you wouldn't say it in today's climate. The word would be, get ready, abject. Okay? That's a good theoretical word. Make a note. Don't say, this work disgusts me. Say, it's abject. Okay? I'm being a little bit facetious, maybe over the top. But anyway, the point is that I think that how we articulate these things is very important. And, you know, when I think of this idea of symptoms, I think that one of the points that Joseph Beuys brought into the art world, I don't know how well Beuys was really understood in the United States. He had a huge following in Europe of people, I think, who really grasped what he was trying to do. Stylistically, he was followed here, but I'm not sure about the content. But he used to use the sign of the half Red Cross that would sometimes be attached, or sometimes the full Red Cross, depending on what piece. And I'm not sure why sometimes it was cut in half and sometimes it was full. But the point is that his social sculpture, which was a very important idea in the last 50 years of contemporary art, his social sculpture was about trying to find the ills that are within a social structure and to repair them. So one could say that whereas we have physicians in the medical profession. Joseph Beuys was a true metaphysician. Probably being German, he had to be a metaphysician. And I use that in the Aristotelian manner when there is not a category that you can deal with in terms of the sensory perception of objects in the world. We have to put it within the realm of the metaphysical, that which goes beyond the physical. But Beuys was in search of deficiency, not in an ironic or cynical way. Beuys was not that. But he was interested in where the difficult zones were, the problematic zones that needed to be revised in terms of a social structure. Most of these, without exception, I think all of them had to do with institutions of one form or another. Educational institutions, for sure. Legislative institutions, medical institutions, all forms of institutions that consider the system and the operation of the system as being more important than the human being. This is when Beuys exclaims that every human being is an artist. What he meant by that, of course, is every human being is potentially an artist. Why are they potentially an artist? Because they are locked up inside, under the control of the institutions. Therefore, there has to be a way of unlocking, unraveling, opening up people so that the institutions are ancillary or perhaps unnecessary in relation to how to fulfill one's life. I think that one of the issues, it's more than an issue, it's a problem that we suffer from in this country at this particular time, is that we have either lost or are in the process of losing a sense of the quality of life. I don't know how art can exist other than in terms of its reference to money if there is not a quality of life that is shared. Earlier this summer I was in Europe, in Italy, in Tuscany. My God, you know, how they deal with the tourists, I don't know, really. But they do. I think they'd better deal with the tourists because otherwise they'll be broker than they are. But the point is that they enjoy life. Now, I don't think New York precludes enjoying life. It's just that sometimes we get deviated and we think too much in terms of material. We think too much in terms of struggling for what we think we should have, but don't have. This becomes problematic. It gets in the way. There is no institution that is going to help you. Now, ultimately, I think it comes down to a kind of existential level. And in a recent conversation with my friend Lucio Pozzi, who used to teach at School of Visual Arts for many years, I saw him when I was in Tuscany. He's Italian, obviously, and we were talking about this problem of the quality of life. And he said he had to move back to Italy. So he moved back, and he got remarried. And I think that Lucio is always going to be frustrated in one way or another, but he seems very clear about himself in terms of what he is trying to do. It's very difficult to find that clarity I think, in an urban center where the quality of life is not given a priority. I love urban centers. And having just come from Shanghai, I can tell you what a magnificent place in terms of an urban center. But thinking, feeling as a single unit of presence is not so bad. And it's something I believe that artists should strive for, not struggle with, but strive for. I think that a relaxed state of mind allows you to have an ability to unravel those nemeses that stand in the way of the perception of a career. I feel this. I don't know if I'm getting any better at it or if I'm still striving for it myself. Maybe it's something that we always should strive for, because it's not just the individual at stake, but it's how the individual is contextualized within the social. And I'm very happy with many of my students who are instinctively bound to this idea, much more than I think my generation became. I think at one point we thought that to be the case, but the drugs interfered. And once the drugs left, everybody got greedy. But I think in the current generation, it's a little different. The stakes are tougher in a way, but I think that there is a greater sense of resolve and in some ways maturity on a certain level that I have seen. I'm talking about artists now. And however one chooses to make one's way is okay. And I say that because often we are put in the position of making it one way. But I think with the lateral spread of how things are functioning today, since we have become globalized, it's very difficult to think in terms of making it in one way. I would say at this juncture, in terms of our history, and I tend to put history in the present tense, much like the Europeans do, or for that matter, even the Chinese. I remember growing up in school, the history was always the past, but I like this idea that it's in the present, that we are thinking in terms of where we are right now. Getting a sense of control in terms of who we are in relation to one another, how to speak, how to think. Not that somebody's telling us that, but that we are generating that dialogue. We are generating that dialogical moment, as Martin Buber once put it, where we feel strong and we are ready to encounter what we need to encounter to deal with what we have to deal with. This is so important. Being able to go one's own way is better than going one way. Now, I'm just going to conclude with one point, and then I want to get some questions and comments from you, because I have no idea how you're responding to what I'm saying. You're such a great audience, or you're seething with anger, one or the other. But anyway, you know, when I learned art history, and maybe the way you learned art history, it was diachronic. And I'm using the structural term of Piaget because I really love it. It's so clear to me that, in other words, one movement follows the other. And actually that was talked about by Jose Ortega y Gasset as well, that there is, for example, neoclassicism coming out of the Grande Manière. And the French are great at this because they love this kind of thinking. They're Cartesian, after all. And then there is the dialectical shift toward Romanticism. And all the while, the salon is becoming stronger and stronger as money is becoming more and more available. But Romanticism is taking a kind of sidestep and moving into the uniqueness of the artist. And of course, the major figure in terms of that symbol of the unique artist in the 19th century was Courbet. When he was asked, well, what movement do you belong to? Plein air, Romanticism, Neoclassicism? He said in his typical pious way, I am a Courbetist. Okay, Courbetist. You're on your own. That's where art is going. And he foreshadowed modernism in that sense. I think that I would have to agree that Manet, probably from the point of view of art, was more important, but I think from the point of view of being an artist, Courbet was more important. And I think both are important. How do you discover the direction which is, for you, the next step? And how do you be an artist? Both of those are important, and they're not always conjoined. They should be, maybe. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, they're not exactly the same. Now, okay, you get the Impressionists, you get the Post-Impressionists, you get the Pontavon school, you get the Nobbies, Fauvism, Cubism, German Expressionism. You move into the early utopias of Futurism. There's a show that's closing, I think, very soon at the Guggenheim that I would recommend. You get into Surrealism, of course, which is a kind of utopia from the point of view of Breton's idea of mind, okay? A very interesting point of view. You get into constructivism, of course, the idea of Dada as a kind of rebellion against the middle class, épater la bourgeoisie, for example, which is also a great idea, particularly for that time period. Maybe we should bring that back. But to bring Dada back, you really got to understand what the politique is. You can't make an avant-garde movement out of academia. There has to be a political energy that offers the resistance. You have to put your life on the line to be an avant-gardist. Let's change that word. Put your career on the line to be an avant-gardist in real terms. But you know, since the market has become so aggressive and so strong, and since the media can turn things around in hours, it's very difficult to retain the persistence of avant-gardism. One of the problems is that most of the art schools that I visited recently are still teaching the avant-garde in studio. What can you do that's revolutionary and new? Rather than, hey, why don't you do this really well? Because this is interesting and eventually it's going to be something. But the avant-garde, I have to say, is an old idea. It's an old idea. Anyway, let me put it this way. This chronology that I've been referring to, basically since the late 18th century to maybe the late 20th century, maybe the 80s. I think that when Neo-Expressionism came onto the scene, the repetition, of course, was a sign among postmodern theorists that, you know, we're beginning now the repetitions. But I don't think any of that stuff is so important in terms of controlling what you are doing. I think that either you have the desire and you're committed to your desire and you want to put that desire into some kind of sublimated manifestation. Now, Picasso did precisely that in 1906 when he began Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Precisely. And he was contemporary with Freud. Freud's book had come out in 1899. Sublimation is where you take an internal conflict and you generate positive energy. When you see these 5 women on stage, you can talk about it in whatever way you want. You can talk about it from a feminist perspective, maybe not so well from a feminist perspective. You can speak about it from many perspectives. You can talk about it as a kind of early expressionism. Maybe that painting is more expressionism than it is cubist. Nobody has ever convinced me that Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was the beginning of cubism. I see it more as connected with what was going on with Erich Heckel in Dresden, which happened to be a year earlier in 1905 with De Broca. I think it's closer to that from my point of view. So the label is not so important. The label is not so important. What is important is the act of sublimation, whereby, remember that Picasso had lost his best friend from syphilis, who committed suicide in Barcelona, in Avignon. He wasn't going to go any further than Barcelona. His idea was to get away from his father in Malaga, who was the art teacher. In Spain, you don't want to be the son or daughter of an art teacher. It'll kill your career. Being the son or daughter of an artist is another thing, but an art teacher, the one who has that kind of authority, he had to escape. So what does Picasso do? Very smart guy. He takes the name of his mother. Picasso is his mother's name. Ruiz is his father's name. And he goes with his friend to Barcelona. His friend dies tragically. And Picasso said, there's nothing left for me here. I go on to Paris. He may have not gone on to Paris, but he had to sublimate this and to transform it into something that was positive energy. Actually, from Eastern point of view, there's no such thing as positive energy. It's redundant. You either got the energy or you don't. Either the chi is there or it's locked up inside. But the point is, whatever you want to call it, East or West, Picasso did it. And that's more important than the labels. Whatever the conflict is, use it. Defer it. Produce something that is magnificent. I was going to talk about another aspect of the diachronic, and that was the synchronic. I think today we are at a synchronic moment in history. In other words, instead of all these categories of art that are moving in this vertical linearity, presumably into infinity, we're not there. We've got over 200 nations now in the world. And we've got advanced technology to contact artists in these places throughout the world. It's a new generation. It's a new time. It's exciting. God bless you. Am I okay with time?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Any comments?
This is for recording purposes only. If anyone has any questions.
I will sit.
When you talk about like globalization and I guess from a creative standpoint, the idea of like looking at the world from the inside out.
Right. From inside out, yes, which I think is what artists should be doing, yeah.
Is there any sort of conflict in the idea of globalization and then maybe if the inherent differences between people and cultures and identities?
Well, I think this is the model of economic globalization because, frankly, this is not, the issue of difference in terms of people is not a priority for the economic globalists, which is one of the problems. Okay, this is one of the problems. I think, and maybe the term that I'm using, cultural globalization, is not correct. But the idea, I think, is correct, and that is that we have the opportunity now to break down the geographical centrism and to begin finding colleagues in various places of the world that we can work with in terms of ideas that we agree upon, more or less, or that we want to have a dialogue, more or less, and begin structuring the future in terms of a new way of thinking about art. Now that, to me, feels positive. As I say it, it feels positive. But this is not the position of the economic globalists, which is where globalism began, okay? They're not interested in the fulfillment of life or the quality of life of individuals. I mean, it might be part of the rhetoric, and it depends on who you're talking to. I think this woman in India, I can't remember her name, is quite interesting in that she's the only one that comes close to that idea, that maybe the goal that we want in terms of the spread and sharing of the resources is that people can have fulfilling lives. I think that Obama would be very much in agreement with that idea. I think that he's getting incredible resistance because he has this idea, among others. I mean, there are some people that, believe it or not, in politics who really are idealists, which I'm always looking for. I was a great fan of Václav Havel, for example, in the Czech Republic, and his writings are so inspiring. I would recommend them to all of you. Anyway, let me just say that difference is essential for everything. There's no conversation if there's no difference. Otherwise, you already agree and there's nothing to talk about. There has to be difference. Yes?
Should I go or? Sure. Can I have it after you?
Sure. You mentioned that we have, like, do you feel that we have a very Western way of thinking the art world? Because we tend to fall back on theory and logic, and there's this kind of modular where people have to feel like they have to be the avant-garde artists and be very progressive, opposed to being just good at this one thing and it will be something, or something just beautiful and aesthetic. Where I feel like a very Eastern way of thinking is more instinctual and there's energy to it. Do you feel that with the new generation of artists, or is there still like a conflict in how we look at things but we don't see them?
Yeah. First of all, again, I want to repeat myself and say that, you know, it's difficult to generalize, okay? And maybe I made a mistake talking about your generation. It's just that I have had such great experiences with people in your generation in terms of hearing things that I have never thought of in the context that they're presenting them, okay? And that gives me a great deal of hope and, you know, inspiration, I mean, to, you know, move ahead with what I'm doing, you know? I like being in that context of, I mean, just for your information, I have a son and a daughter. Neither one of them is doing anything in art. My son graduated from MIT, he's 23, and my daughter's teaching school, she's 30, okay? So they come from different mothers, you know, different families. I recently was remarried 3 weeks ago. What did I do that for? Anyway, getting back to your question. To separate the instinctual, I think that's the word you used, am I correct? From the theoretical and the avant-gardism, I think that most of what Dada did, for example, which would be an extreme example, was more instinctual. And I think later it became theory. Now, let me just say this. I mean, theory is okay. It just depends on how you use it. And one of the problems that I've noticed, I don't know about your courses at School of Visual Arts or wherever you're going to school, but generally, students have been asked to write something about what they do and sit in a circle instead of like this where you're facing me, presumably the authority. Everybody's in a circle, which I like, and they read their text about what they're doing. Okay, so you've read the text and then you have the artwork. The problem is that everybody is sort of talking, disagreeing, dialoguing about the text. And by the time you wrap that up and look at the work, it precludes any possibility of experience with the work itself. Because the bulwark, I don't know how to put it, the kind of underlying defense that is within the theoretical construct is, from my point of view, the wrong way to go. I would, and getting back to Dada, because I think it's an interesting point that you raise, it's much better, rather than having an a priori text, to have an a posteriori text. And I'm getting these terms from Kant, okay? The a priori text comes before the phenomenon, and the a posteriori comes after the phenomenon. I think that art should be about pulling things out, new ideas. I think that a great work of art should bristle and sparkle with potential new ideas. That's what art can do at its best. But if it's over-theorized at the origins, you lose the possibility of having an experience. And the experience is precious in terms of how we enter into a discourse on art, which I believe is important. I think that we all need to enter into a discourse on art, which is a kind of theory. But you know, right now I'm doing a monograph on the premier calligrapher in China. His name is Wang Dongling, okay? And I mean, he's absolutely magnificent. He was in that show called Ink Art. I don't know if any of you saw it at the Metropolitan. And he actually did a demonstration of his calligraphy in the garden there adjacent to the galleries where the show was. This was about 3 months ago. The thing about Wang Dongling is he was asked what is the essential core of his art that gives him the energy. Wang Dongling is 68 years old, and he can cover a large gymnasium in an hour with his ideographs. Phenomenal, because the energy is slow. The energy is slow, and he knows how to control it. So at the end of doing 180 characters on the paper that's spread out in the gymnasium, he's relaxed because he's never been uptight, because he's never been tense and needed to release the tension. It's the slow energy. I love that idea. I mean, you mentioned the East and West. I think that in the West, we need more slow energy. We need more a posteriori discussion that leads us into an exciting discourse in art. I think Wang Dongling's idea, when he was asked about the core of his art, to have a warm heart. Interesting.
Happy early birthday and congratulations.
Thank you.
This is a bit of a slant, I guess. I was wondering, because you have a painting practice as well, and
Yes.
you just had a solo exhibition, if you could talk about what you feel your impetus is to make that work, and if that you feel relates or has evolved in tandem or in relation to your practice as a writer, art historian, curator, all those things.
You made my day asking me a question about my own art. Occasionally it happens, not too often. I am a hard-edge classicist, and in addition to obviously being influenced by Motherwell, which is one reason I wanted to see him, where it really locked in was a couple of years later in 1968 when I saw a show of John McLaughlin at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. John McLaughlin, for those of you who don't know, was the painter who inspired the light and space movement, which would include James Turrell, Robert Irwin, Doug Wheeler, and Craig Kaufman. These are pretty heavy hitters in terms of California art, but he was just a painter. And he was inspired during the time he was living in Japan. He stayed there at the end of the war in the late 40s and early 50s, and he learned Japanese. And he was particularly interested in the work of Sesshu, who was a 15th century painter in Japan who was able to get the visa, which was not so easy in the 15th century, to go study with the Ming Dynasty masters in China. And his real reason is he wanted to learn the techniques of the Northern Sung Dynasty from them. But anyway, the point is, that's beside it. A lot of where my career went goes back to John McLaughlin. I think he passed away in 1976, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so we had a correspondence that's now in the Archives of American Art. And when somebody told me that, I said, "How do you have the archives?" Because I have all his letters. And the man said, "He copied every letter that he sent to you, you know, handwritten, you know." So anyway, I have one, and the archives has one. But now, Heritage classes, I went a very different direction in the sense that I liked light, reflection, and absorption on the surface. And I've always worked with metallic, well, since 1970, I've worked with metallic colors, okay? And only recently have I discovered, through a Korean painter by the name of Yoon Hyung-gun, who is no longer alive, who died in 2007. Yoon Hyung-gun, who I never met, had this way of mixing ultramarine and burnt umber to create this very warm black. It was a wonderful, wonderful black, and the way it absorbs light is so fantastic. And I saw his work for the first time at the Gwangju City Museum in 2000. And so I decided I'm going to start using black instead of white as my surface. And as soon as I started doing that, I started getting this yin-yang thing of, instead of the polarization, it was happening instantly. The light was reflecting from the metallic paint and absorbing in relation to the warm black. So it was happening at the same time, the reflection and absorption. Now that had a big meaning for me, okay? And also I decided that I want to work small. I want to be able to visually control the surface that I'm looking at, that I'm painting. And I think that all of painting that I've seen recently is large. I want it to be small. I mean, not this, but this, okay? I feel comfortable with that. And also, I feel that the whole idea of scale can be implied as being larger than what it is that you see. And I think from an American point of view, the question is, well, then why don't you make it larger? Because it fits perfectly on that surface. So all of these issues are important to me, but I guess I am trying to find a place where Eastern thought and my Western upbringing are connecting in terms of what I do. And I want this to be a kind of opening for people who experience the work. I still deal with geometry in terms of the metallic forms. I probably got that from the constructivists, I'm sure I did. But the color and the light is Eastern. Thanks for asking. So I suspect that there are issues that interest you that I did not speak about, because I can only speak about what I know. And what didn't I address that you feel is important for you?
Robert, you were talking about the avant-garde, and it's a military term.
That's right.
And you mentioned Jeff Koons several times, and I was thinking of the term globalization, and then I was thinking of...
Well, I'm not sure that Koons is avant-garde, by the way. I did
No,
mention
no,
him several times.
I would agree. I'm trying to get to some notion of being partisan and what it is right now in terms of the war, an artist's war, the war between the marketplace and the artist's spirit. And the term globalization, I kept thinking of homogenization. Then I kept thinking of various rich art collectors' yachts parked around the world decorated by famous artists. So I'm just speaking out loud, if you have any...
Well, you know,
And the role of the critic.
Yeah, I'm aware of the fact that there's a lot of talk like this, and finally, I think it's rather negative, and I don't want to go there. I wrote that book 14 years ago, The End of the Art World, and I have some other unpublished ones that I'm just holding back simply because I'm not sure that I want them to go out, because people will think that that's my current position, and my current position is trying not to be negative, but to find another way to deal with that reality that you're posing. And so one of the reasons I don't work large, in addition to I like that kind of control of my visual field and being close to it, is that all the paintings I see are large. And I guess another point, you know, if I can continue that, is that I'm trying to create painting that has very little, if any, access to language. Where you simply have nothing to say. And also, I think that my work has no access to taste. I don't think it's possible to like it or not like it. I mean, even though I work very hard on it, you know. But I'm not sure that that's bad. Maybe it's because I've got this open field. I mean, I never know exactly what I'm going to end up with when I start, even though it's very reduced. And I keep, you know, going over lines and moving them back and forth and so forth. It looks like, you know, I just did a sketch and then did the painting, but I didn't. And that never happens. I may do sketches, but the painting ends up to be something completely different once I get to that scale. A couple times, you know, I've had to move the scale up a bit in order for it to work. And sometimes I've had to move it from a square to a rectangle to make it work, okay? But I have, as a writer and a critic, I realize my position. You know, it's tough. And I'm not trying to struggle for something that I know I'm not going to get, but I insist that I be known as an artist. Yes?
My question's also, it's sort of related. I was wondering, I know that you're very interested in Eastern studies and you've spent time in Asia, and a lot of your work is influenced by that in sort of a metaphysical realm. Is that, would you say, also symptomatic in an opposite way to somebody who's being hyper-literal, like Jeff Koons? Do you feel like it's a, you know, a way of balancing?
Well, I mean, when I sense something significant, you know, when I, you know, I'm in a quandary where I have to do a double take or a triple take in order to satisfy my desire, and even then I'm not satisfied, okay? Then I begin to think that maybe I'm dealing with something significant, okay? I mean, we can, I mean, anything that's within the realm of cultural anthropology is symptomatic, but that could also include art. But there are works of art who transcend that being symptomatic and become significant. And the traveling I've done, by the way, I should say, has never been through any kind of academic or museum institution. It's always done by invitation from somebody who wants me to come. That's very important to understand. And that way I have liberty to talk with the artists that I'm interested in talking, because I found that there are some great artists out there that have no connection to the market. And when I hear these comments from collectors saying, well, unless they're in the market, they're not important, I feel like saying, you know, I think you have to wake up and learn a little bit more and maybe relax your lifestyle a bit to really understand why art can be great in the first place. But it's great, some of this stuff that I see. And, you know, obviously I do my best in terms of trying to promote it, you know, in my writing. And, you know, I don't know how many people read these days, but sometimes, maybe once in a while, like this woman who contacted me from Brussels, I think that, you know, she was excited about something I'd written about this artist Lin Yan. Great, you know. I really believe in Lin Yan. First of all, she's one of the few Chinese women who is working non-objectively, you know, which is already something, you know. But, you know, the thing about gender in terms of my work, I remember over 20 years ago, I came out with a book called After the Deluge. And somebody came up to me and said, oh, Robert, I think it's so great that you're writing about women. And I was completely nonplussed because I didn't know what she was talking about. And then I realized that most of the essays in the book were about women, okay? But I wasn't even thinking of that when I did the book. So it's not the priority for me. You know what I'm saying? But I'm completely open to it. I think I can say that honestly. And Lin Yan is a great artist from my point of view. And I really want to promote her. And actually, I want to promote her husband as well, because I think he's a great artist. But I'm trying to separate them. They always want to show together, and I'm saying, no, no, Lin Yan, you do your and let him do his. And because I think it's better in terms of a career move than always showing together. I mean, I understand, you know, they're a beautiful couple and so forth, but they really need, career-wise, not to be moving on the same track, from my point of view.
So I'm curious, talking of sort of symptoms and transcendence coming out of that, how does your criticism practice or your art criticism practice inform your paintings?
Good question. I try and I think I found something that is not what I usually write about, which is just the opposite from a lot of people, you know, who want to only talk about artists who do what they do. I mean, the Brooklyn Rail is filled with these people. Okay, if you still read that, I think it's yesterday's science fiction, frankly. But the point is that they're writing about what they do. You know, I don't do that. You know, I think I'm probably the most liberal critic in America in terms of being able to stretch all the way from you know, digital art to, you know, deep expressionism, you know, and everything in between. But it's always something that interests me. And in a way, it liberates me at both ends. I mean, in other words, by, you know, having this rather strict focus in terms of what I'm doing and having worked on it for many, many years, it's liberated me to write about what I want to write about. And at the same time, it offers a kind of sanctuary, my own space and my own time and my own reflex in terms of, you know, the idea that in China, for example, the stroke could be an image or writing. The stroke. In my culture, which is a Western culture, I don't have that liberty. I have to figure out a way of moving between painting and writing. And today I just, well, no, it was 2 days ago I finished a painting for my new wife that I just gave her. I've been working on it for 3 months. And it made her very happy, and it made me very happy, you know. I rarely have painted anything for anybody, but I wanted her to know my love and to feel that in terms of this painting. And she's Asian, and she responded to it, and it made me so happy. okay? But I think that one thing defines the other for me. You know, what I don't do in writing, I do in painting. What I don't do in painting, I write about.
You say that now that artists are talking to each other, or dealing with similar themes or similar concerns from across the world, do you think New York is still the epicenter of the art world still, or do you think that idea is kind of dissolving?
Good question. In my remarks, I said that there was almost 30 years of a great period in New York paint, where in fact movements were generated out of New York. You know, and I think during that period, which is after the long French period, we got almost 30 years of generating very important movements, and maybe the last movements, as we know that idea in the history of art, came out of the United States. But I think that what we have now is a very aggressive market. And I think people are confused because, I think, Robin, your point was interesting. I think that people are flummoxed by this notion that, you know, how do you be an artist in that kind of aggressive marketplace? And, you know, one reason I wrote that book, The End of the Art World, was to deal with that. Of course, it's maybe, you know, too far back now, but on the other hand, I think there's some pretty good ideas with it, and if you haven't read it, I think it's something you might find of interest. But the point is this, that I think the major struggle living in New York, I mean, one of the great things about New York, you know, is there's so much art. It can be a blessing and it can be a curse, you know? I mean, how many nights are there 6 openings in 6 different places and you can't possibly go, and all of them you want to go to, but you can't possibly do it? I'm sure you've had this. I'm sure you've all had this experience. Okay, you know, you have to make a choice, and I think that making the choice is also something that is very important in terms of your art. You know, that you're making a choice that you want to work the way you want to work, regardless if you're getting the kind of response you want or not. You're working the way you want to work, and if nobody's responding, make it better from your point of view. Not from what they want, but make it better, and stay with it. I mean, be part of the times, but stay with it.
I think I know why I want to kind of jump on Brenda's question, and I know this special talking stick. But, okay. So for artists that are not based in New York, it's easier to travel back and forth and do other things, but a couple years ago, I'm in the 3rd year of the program, and so is Brenda and some others here as well. We were talking to Holland Cotter, and he was saying some very interesting things, which I won't quote, obviously, but one of the things that he was saying is that a lot of times he feels that you have to look elsewhere and go farther afield to see some interesting things happening, perhaps basically because they're not generated by the market, or they don't have any expectation of being a part of the market. And I don't think that's your question, Brenda, actually.
That's the kind of New York Times. That's the kind of New York Times attitude. I mean, the assumption that he's making is that everybody is influenced by the market, and if you're consciously working not to be influenced
I don't
by
want
the
to
market.
say that's what he said either. That was 2 years
all
ago.
right.
I don't want to speak.
No,
for him.
but I think, I mean, I know other people. You know, I know Holland obviously, but I know other people that I believe their assumption. I believe their assumption is that it's impossible to be in the art world and not be influenced by everything else. Well, you can see things that you like, but ultimately, it's your own work. Now, how to put it? I always try and find out if what I'm liking is something that is too close to me. And if it is, then I have to think about whether I want to keep it or not. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't, as an artist.
I think one of the things, sorry, I'm just like, I'm not trying to hog this if anybody else wants to raise their hand. But one of the things that excites me about this place, and Robin's here, so I don't mean to blow smoke at him, but there seems to be a sense of collective that happens here that is akin to that history that you're speaking of, that in New York, that Robin was a big part of, and others, faculty that we have here as well. And I think, for me, it's a very optimistic time that, maybe it has been so much in that direction that it's about to, have pockets of going the other way. I think, again, you can't really generalize everyone, because I know I'm not really interested in the market, and I know other people here as well, though I'd love to sell a painting, sure. But that there are other concerns in mind now because of that kind of hierarchy of making it a certain way, having been broken down through necessity, probably. But I don't know if that made any sense, but it comes to mind.
Well, the fact is that being in New York, you feel the pressure of the market. That's the thing. And I think you have to be aware of it, and you have to confront it, but in a way that is useful to you and appropriate in terms of your position out there, wherever out there might be. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned that there was just a different kind of processes between East and West in terms of how they view art, and them being more kind of in alignment with the metaphysics. Do you find that?
Well, it's two different kinds of metaphysics, I think.
Two different, yeah.
Yeah.
But do you find that that now, because you mentioned that you've had students who would make these comments and it would kind of spark your interest, that there is more of an kind of like an intention to tap more into kind of with the globalization, tap more into how other people view art and how metaphysics is maybe was always present, but now becoming more kind of highlighted in terms of the Western ideology or thought of how they view art?
Well, I don't know about the Western ideology, but I know that it's deeply embedded, as Confucianism is deeply embedded in China. I mean, you can't really separate that particular kind of social relationship to metaphysics from Confucius, because that's his point. Okay, but where we are in terms of that, I think I don't know what I think. I'm interested in it. At one time, I was calling my paintings metaphysical paintings. I thought that was okay, but I don't know where that is as a trend or where that is as a consensus, if you want to call it that. I think that there are other concerns that people have before they get to metaphysics. But I think it's a good way to think right now. I think beyond categories, and that's important, or I try to. I'm not always successful.
Can you explain more on, just because it's so broad, metaphysics, what it means to you in terms of your process of?
Well, let me go back again to Aristotle. There were various sensory capacities for dealing with knowledge. And there is one that could not be labeled, and that was metaphysics. Now, that meant that the imagination was the generator of metaphysical belief. In that sense, somebody like Jean Genet would be a great metaphysician. Sartre called him an existentialist, but I would see him as a great metaphysician because he believed that the imagination was what could save him from the turmoil of his life, essentially. And also, I believe that sublimation and metaphysics, even though one is psychoanalysis and one is philosophy, are ultimately very close. I think that living in a metaphysical state of thinking is interesting because you have to posit yourself as being a citizen of the world, not just of a particular country or culture. I mean, it can limit, you can limit it, but I think that the nature of metaphysics is to open up rather than to close down. And I think that that opening up is so terribly necessary right now in terms of art. Because when people start falling into a career path, the tendency is to shut down, not to open up. But it's a kind of give and take in both directions, from my point of view. But I think ultimately, it's a kind of what Johns used to call an unequal equation, where you're opening up and you're closing down, but you're opening up more.
We're at a good stopping point, and we'll keep it ready for your next report, Chris. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it.